Okay, welcome to week 12 of early Christian history. I am sorry for the tardiness of this, and boy, I hope I can get it to you in time to where this all makes sense. But anyway, going to produce this quick. I hope the whole thing is under 20 minutes, so I'll get right into it. 2 weeks ago, or actually last week, we talked about the Golden Age of China, the Tang Dynasty and Emperor Taizong. He's the one who introduced Confucius, the ancient philosopher, to the Chinese people and really adopted a lot of his teachings. Well, his empress, one of his concubines, again, sign of the times, multiple wives, was a woman named Wu Zetian, and she remains the only female empress in China's history. Very interesting story behind her. Again, lots of stability during the Tang Dynasty, and Wu Zetian was one of the concubines of the emperor at the time. She is depicted in all art, and there have been a whole lot of Chinese movies made about her. A very famous figure, obviously, in Chinese history and culture. She is always depicted as not just a pretty woman, but just a stunningly gorgeous woman. Evidently, she was able to use this physical beauty to do an awful lot of stuff, for better and for worse. But anyway, she was the emperor's one of the emperor's concubines. When Emperor Taizong died, it was the custom for the concubines of an emperor who dies to live the rest of their lives in a Buddhist nunnery, where they shave their heads and take vows and live the rest of their lives like that. And that is depicted in a lot of these movies, this part of her life. Well, Wu Zetian was a very ambitious and very smart woman, and was not satisfied with that. As a matter of fact, she had been very, very involved in the political scene at the emperor's palace in China. Was very, very influential. And she decided that she was not going to spend the rest of her life, and she had many years left, rotting away in a nunnery. So she set her sights on capturing the heart of the new emperor, which was Emperor Taizong's son, Gaozong. Now, it was not one of her children. Kind of want to point that out, because he was evidently captivated by Wu Zetan's beauty, and against all custom, removed her from the nunnery and took her on as a concubine. And Wu, of course, gladly accepted. Now, it was an outrage for a lot of Chinese, but again, Wu Zetian didn't care. She was breaking a whole lot of norms. She continued to break norms. She accused the main empress, an Empress Wang, of murdering one of her children, one of the emperor's children. And even though there was no evidence, she was banished from the castle. And lo and behold, Wu Zetian became the main empress. Now, again, that's not an official position of power in China, but she was exerting a whole lot of influence. She was very much a power behind the throne. It was basically the highest position a woman could have in China. Still not enough to satisfy Wu Zetian. For several years, she was, again, very influential in policy. She convinced her husband to make many changes to the government. Any of the emperor's advisors who questioned her were shown the way out. In many cases, were fired. Things became serious very quickly, though, and this is important to remember. The year 660 A.D., Emperor Gaozong suffered what we now know was a stroke. And if you've ever seen a victim of a bad stroke, you know they can live many years after that, but they are very much incapacitated, unable to handle affairs. Well, Wu Zetian took this opportunity to become the sort of de facto emperor of China on behalf of her husband, even though there was never any official recognition that she had that authority. But she took it. And she evidently had enough people on her side. The people who opposed her had been fired. And so she was, for all practical purposes, the emperor of China. And her ambition was still not sated. She still wanted more. Instead of being fired, opponents to Wu Zetian all of a sudden disappeared, or they were encouraged to commit suicide. Now, that having been said, she was a very effective leader during this time. China saw a very strong central government, a period of relative peace. It was 23 years after his stroke that Emperor Gaozong passed away. So for 23 years, she is more or less the Emperor of China. That's a long, long reign. But she still wasn't done. She had bore the emperor two sons, and the sons were made emperors. But Wu, Mama, was calling the shots. And again, she retained her mysterious power even while her two sons were emperor. She quickly began favoring one son over the other, for whatever reason, probably loyalty. And the other son was disposed, and she made the claim officially that she, Wu Zetian, was the emperor of China, and it worked. For the next 15 years, she ruled as the, in fact, emperor of China. So when you take that along with the 23 years that Emperor Gaozong had a stroke, and the several years before that where she was very influential, she was more or less China's emperor for almost a half a century. That's a long time to reign. And again, the history proves she was a very effective leader. There were major agricultural improvements made to China. Taxes were evidently at a stable level. Public works upgraded. The court system was reformed a little bit. She raised the status of women in general in China. Now, there hasn't been an empress since then, but it was quite a contrast from her first husband, from the Tang Dynasty, Emperor Taizong, who again was very fond of Confucius. And Confucius, the ancient philosopher, had a very dim view of women. And so she basically pushed Confucius off to the side, but she did embrace Buddhism, much like her first husband. Matter of fact, Wu Zetian was in charge of the building, or commissioned the building of lots of the pagodas that still stand even to this day. Some call her a cold-blooded woman who lusted after power and murdered people. That's true. They call her also a very effective ruler, and someone who elevated the status of women more so than probably any other woman in history. That's also true in all likelihood. Again, history is complicated. We have very few people who wear white hats and black hats all the time. Wu Zetian was very ambitious, and her methods for obtaining power were at best questionable, at worst downright demonic, but she was an effective ruler. And there was more good that came from her rule than bad. Do the ends justify the means? I'm glad I don't have to make that call. That's up to God. Second part of the lesson this week takes me back to when I was a little 10-year-old boy named Chucky. I read Beowulf. It's a it was adapted to be sort of a modern day sort of sci-fi type dealy. But Beowulf, quite simply, is the oldest piece of English literature that we have. Now, if you were to take a look at the original wording of Beowulf, it wouldn't look anything like English. It's Old English. It's unrecognizable. But it is English that predates ours, and it is one of the few pieces of this portion of the Dark Ages that survived. And it's not just old, again, it's an insight into the culture. It was actually written in Anglo-Saxon England, but the story takes place in Scandinavia, Sweden and Denmark, where Beowulf is a great hunter, a great hero who lives in southern Sweden. In Denmark, a monster named Grendel attacked a dinner party and killed 30 people, all of them wealthy landowners. The whole area was alarmed and wanted to kill this monster. Well, there's only one that can kill it, Beowulf. So Beowulf and 15 of his friends go after this terrible creature named Grendel. Grendel described in the book as almost picture him like a troll, like 30 feet tall, gray scaly skin, long fingers. They really got into detail in the book. Beowulf tracks Grendel down, and he has his sword, does Beowulf, and he throws the sword away and decides to wrestle him with his bare hands. What a guy, huh? And during the course of the fight, he rips Grendel's arm off. And Grendel, mortally wounded, goes back to his cave where Beowulf and the others track him down. Much to their surprise, they run into Grendel's mother. And Mama is not happy. So Grendel's mother attacks Beowulf and in revenge, and Beowulf trounces the mama as well and becomes a great hero to the Danish people. He's made king of the Danes, and according to the book, he served 50 years of relative peace. After 50 years, there are reports of another monster, and this one is described unambiguously as a fire-breathing dragon. Now, it's interesting to note, dragons were mythologically have more to do with China than with Europe, so there was no intermingling here, really, probably, when the English folks here came up with their own vision of a dragon, a fire-breathing beast. So again, you get these commonalities in cultures that have not interacted with each other. They all need a great villain. Every great hero needs a great villain. How could you be a great hero if you don't slay the great dragon, the great villain, or something like that? So again, it points to our need. Again, you can't have a hero unless there's something that they're fighting. And Beowulf and his friend Wiglaf battle the fire-breathing dragon, who's never named, but they do use their swords here, and Beowulf cuts him in half. But in the process, he gets a mortal wound to his throat. And there's like one chapter of his dying words, and I mean, it's like something right out of a movie. 50 years have I ruled the people in peace so that none of our neighbors will attack us. I've endured toil and earth, and now I send this to you, my friend Wiglaf, to rule in my stead. Yeah, just a cool story. If you're a 10-year-old boy, I mean, this guy is all that and much more. Now, again, from a historic standpoint, yes, it is the oldest piece of English literature surviving, so that in and of itself makes it noteworthy. It also, much like King Arthur did when we talked about that legend from a couple centuries before Beowulf, it points to the need in all societies for heroes, or that is persons or persons or a thing that exemplifies the values you hold dear. Every culture has values that they treasure over others. Some of them are pretty common. Again, everybody likes honesty, although there are cultures that do permit lying for, just reasons. But again, I mean, every culture has these values that they want to emphasize, and one of the ways they emphasize is through the mythos, through art, through creating these avatars of their values, the ones they value the most. And Beowulf, much like King Arthur, brave, chivalrous, you name it, that was what this culture treasured. So even in the midst of the Dark Ages, this idea of the heroic avatar of all these things you hold dear is a good clue to what a culture is all about. Our last lesson is on very much an aberration in Europe. We're technically in Europe, but we're in a very little sliver, a corner, bordered on a sea on one end, a mountain on the other. We're talking about the Al-Andalus region of Spain. And if you look at this map, it's the very southern part here, which really, in terms of square mile, is about the size of the state of Rhode Island. It's not a big geographical area, and really only has about 4 or 5 notable cities. But in this little sliver of Europe, culture and art flourished, along with a certain amount of religious freedom, if you want to call it that. To a certain degree, Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived in southern Spain in relative harmony for several centuries. Now, again, a little bit of historic background as to why this region and not the rest of Europe enjoyed this little super renaissance. It was a little bit of geographic isolation involved. You can see in this map the Iberian Peninsula, which includes Spain and Portugal. The very southern tip almost touches Africa. This is the Gibraltar Strait. and you can see where it would be a not too challenging boat ride to go from one side to the other. So unlike, the Mayans out there in the Central America living without any outside influence, there was some swapping around of people, of intermarrying, and the cultural exchanges that'll come along with that. Because again, it's not a very perilous journey. I think that was even at the time, it was a day and a half boat journey to get from one side to the other. And of course, several centuries before the Dark Ages, the Phoenicians, a seagoing people, set up colonies all throughout the Mediterranean. So again, this coastal exploration of the Mediterranean basin had been going on for centuries and centuries. But this one little part right here was significant insofar as, yes, it was under Roman rule for a long time. Rome put in aqueducts around here. But this little what we call Al-Andalus region, I'll get this right, Al-Andalus region, I like to call it Cordoba, because that was what the Christians called it. Plus, it was so cool to hear Ricardo Montalban say Cordoba. And they developed a language that was a little bit different from Spanish. It was Castellan. And if you see any of the highlights from the 1992 Olympics in Barcelona, Spain, it's pronounced Barcelona. The C is a TH sound in Castellan. Otherwise, it's very similar to Spanish. But again, they developed their own culture in southern Spain. The Muslim armies invaded it in 711, calling themselves the Berbers. The Berbers were a people of North Africa, mostly dark-skinned. The Romans had nicknamed them the Moors, from the name of the white-skinned Maori tribe, and they were a large segment of the Berber people. Moor is unpopular among Arabs today, but it's sort of the term that we have come to associate with northern African Muslims of the time. Like we said last week, the Islamic faith started by Muhammad in Mecca in the 600 ADs, spread quickly, and it was all the way through northern Africa. And again, 711, they more or less invaded the Iberian Peninsula and set up a Muslim culture in that part of Spain. The first Moorish army to invade Spain was led by a man named Tariq. And when he sailed through Gibraltar, the two pillars of Hercules there that make up Gibraltar, he called it the Mountain of Tariq, Gebel el Tariq, which became Gibraltar. Long story short, I guess. The ruling family of the Islamic Empire at the time actually was based out of Damascus, Syria, which is, if you look at the Mediterranean map here, Spain's over here. Damascus, Syria is all the way over here. It's clear on the other side of the Mediterranean. The Umayyad family was the ruling dynasty, if you want to call it that. They had a very, very big infight, and half of the family fell out of favor in the year 750. And one of them, Abd al-Rahman, was deposed. His mother had been a Berber in northern Africa, so he fled to northern Africa and joined them. It took him 5 years to get there, if it gives you any idea of how perilous this journey was. What he found, the Berbers, was the opportunity to go even further. They had already moved into southern Spain in 755, and he went there with his name recognition as a member of the Umayyad family, and because he was part Berber himself, he gained the respect of the Berber people. And he basically resurrected the Umayyad dynasty in the west. So you had the Umayyads ruling on one end of the Mediterranean and now on the other end. And he centered his new dynasty in the city of Cordoba. From there, the influence of the prince, he was, again, evidently a very able ruler. He established what we would call fair taxation, police forces in towns, laws, strong marketplaces, and they were very much thriving under the Umayyad rule. They had lots of natural resources there: gold for the money, iron for the practicality. The coast produced exotic coral and pearls. The city of Toledo is where some of the great swords were made. Just about nearly every family, it was said, could afford at least a donkey. which is pretty darn good. The modern day equivalent of every family, no matter how poor, can afford a car. That's not too bad. Yeah, particularly in the Dark Ages, to have that level of economic equality where even the worst family off financially can afford basic transportation, that's not too bad. They had paved streets in Cordoba. They had they were lit at night. The aqueducts that the Romans had built earlier were put to good use, providing fresh water to homes, which is it was a very arid climate there. They were clearly ahead of their times, much like the Romans were a few centuries earlier. And of course, what happens when you have a good standard of living like this, where everyone's relatively well fed, all your other basic needs are met? That's when you go up here and you produce great art. You attract smart people coming in from out of town. They want a piece of this. They want to produce art and great philosophy and literature in your place. At least 400,000 volumes of books were in the Al-Andalus library. A staggering number. It was the biggest library in the world at the time. And again, it happened with Muslims, Jews, and Christians all contributing. Another major factor was that they adopted the use of the Arabic language. Again, Latin was sort of disappearing throughout Europe as fewer and fewer people were speaking it. Only a handful could even read it. They adopted the Arabic language in Al-Andalus simply because it was one that they were familiar with, but also because they found that in terms of communicating higher thoughts, it gave you a few more options than Latin. If any of you have studied Greek before, particularly in terms of a church message, you know that there are several Greek words for love. In English, we say love, and it can mean a whole bunch of different things. Greeks had 4 different words for love. The Arabic language has about a dozen words for love, and again, it's different types of love. It's very specific, very flowery language. And of course, as we know, as we use Arabic numerals, the Arabic language also allowed for great math achievements through the base 10 system. Great architectural achievements during this time. The Great Mosque of Cordoba, which you can still go see today, and it is a treat for the eyes. It took 200 years to build the place, okay? We're talking a major project. It blends Islamic, Roman, and Gothic architectures, nowadays used as a Roman Catholic cathedral, again, kind of owing to the religious plurality we see in this area. It was not always perfect religiously, though. The rules were that while you were free as a Jew or a Christian to practice your religion, you could not openly criticize Islam, and those that did were at best persecuted, at worst executed. So there was religious freedom to a degree. There was religious freedom compared to other areas, but there was not religious freedom. Today, and this still applies today in our dealings, always pay attention to whom you're not allowed to criticize. Those are the ones that rule you. And if you're told that you can't criticize this person or this group, that's not free speech. You do not have free speech. And the people that you can't criticize are ruling you, whether you recognize it or not. That's a very important point. So, yes, this is a better system than open persecution of all Christians like the Romans did so often, but it's not ideal. Again, for many years, they still continue to operate in this matter. Jews and Christians, you're free to build churches, to spread the gospel, but don't speak out against Allah, or we'll kill you. Again, it's better. It's better than a lot of other cultures, but it's not the ideal. So again, history is rarely 100% anything. It's always nuance, and the more we study it, the more we realize that. Outside of Gregory the Great and a few others, there are very few 100% good or bad guys. Again, welcome to history. We'll see you on Monday.